There's a great debate amongst the scientists. Do animals cry? And this debate has extended beyond just scientists. Pet owners have joined in the debate and given their opinions. Do animals cry or only human beings? Do other species cry? So there are varying opinions on this in the world. If you'll ask many pet owners, they'll swear that absolutely animals cry. Their dog or cat, bird, gerbil, they cry, they whimper. When we leave, they start crying. They will swear that the animals do cry. Scientists don't necessarily agree. They will say that animals may give a signal of distress or sadness, but it's not actually crying. Darwin, in his day, he said that animals do cry. He swore that there was an animal, a macaque, monkey, in London Zoo that would cry. Definitely was crying. He said the elephants, Indian elephants, cry. He was sure that certain species cry. Modern science disagrees with that and says that animals do not cry. Only humans cry. If you define crying broadly as any distress signal, so yes, animals do give off distress signals, but actual crying, animals don't do it. And one thing for sure, if you define crying as shedding tears, so only the human being sheds tears. No other species does it. Not that only human beings have tears. Other species do have tears. They have tear ducts and they shed tears, but not as crying. They'll shed tears to moisten their eyes when they blink. They'll shed tears when there's maybe smoke in the air or somebody's chopping onions. But to cry emotionally, to express sadness and shed tears is uniquely human. No other species does it. Which is a fascinating thing. That we're the only ones in the entire universe, we're the only ones who shed tears when we cry. So this must indicate that there is something special about the power of tears, about shedding tears. There must be something unique about it. Something that makes us human, that we cry. And when do we start crying? Straight away. It's pretty much the first thing we do. When we enter the world, the first thing a baby does is cries. And most babies will continue to do that for quite a while. So crying is something only humans do, and we do it from birth. We do it innately. We don't need to learn it. We don't need to be taught how to cry. We don't need to develop the skill. It's something that is innate, natural, and totally uniquely human. So the question is why? Why is this something only we do? And why do we do it? What's the point of crying? What's its function? What's its use? Is it always good? Always the right thing? Is it something that we should develop and do more? Is it something that we should hold back and control? Why do some people cry a lot and some people hardly ever? What is this skill, this talent, this uniquely human expression, shedding tears and crying? And why the tears part? Why do we need the tears? If other species are able to express distress by making noises, so why do humans need to go a step further and we actually shed tears when we cry? Why is that our unique thing? So science will have its say about this and make an attempt to try and explain why humans cry and animals don't. Of course, probably the the first point of reference for science will be an evolutionary type of reason, that there's some benefit that we have from crying, that somewhere along the lines the human developed this ability and it was useful, so it remained. And scientists sort of grope in the dark about this one, I would say, where they try to explain that, well, it seems that the tear is a symbol or a signal to others. It's an expression to somebody else that I am calling for your empathy. That it seems, they try to explain, it's not enough for me to make noises that I'm upset to get your empathy. I need to show you something. And so a tear comes out of my eye to show you that I really need you to care for me because I'm in trouble. I'm going through something. Which is a little unconvincing, because a tear is any stronger than the whimpering itself, than the sound of crying. If you hear somebody crying, you don't see them crying, would you not feel it? Doesn't it get into your kishkas, deep into your guts? When you feel somebody crying, you feel for them without seeing the tears, just the emotion of it, the noise, the sound of crying. Isn't that enough? Like the famous story of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya, who lived in a shared house with his son, Rabbi Dov Ber, known as the Mittel Rebbe, who had a young baby. And the story goes that Rabbi Shneur Zalman was living on the lower floor, and upstairs was his son with his family. And late one night, the two of them, both Rabbi Shneur Zalman and Rabbi Dov Ber, were studying Torah late into the night. They would delve deep into the mysteries of Torah and go into a very almost meditative state where they would be studying and connecting to higher realms. And in the midst of that, Rabbi Shneur Zalman hears the sound of his grandchild crying upstairs. A newly born baby or young baby crying. And the crying continues and doesn't stop. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman closes his book and goes up to find that the baby had rolled out of its crib and was crying. And the baby's father, Rabbi Dov Ber, was there, but deep in his studies. And he didn't hear, he didn't notice it. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman picked up his grandchild, held him and gave a cuddle to relax the baby, put him back into the crib, and then went over to his son, Rabbi Dov Ber, and woke him up from his meditative state and said that no matter how deep your connection is to Torah, it should never block your ears from the sound of a child crying. In other words, he chastised him and said that wasn't right. Maybe you're doing something very spiritual, but if a child's crying, you have to hear that. The higher you go spiritually, the more sensitive you have to be to those around you. So the sound of crying should be enough to arouse us, even from our deepest meditation, no matter how involved we are in something else, even if it's something very worthy and holy. Just the sound of crying should be enough to arouse empathy and to react, to respond. I shouldn't have to see the tears. So the scientific explanation, the tears are our way of gaining empathy so we can survive better because others will help us. It's not so convincing. Apart from the fact that not all tears are public. In fact, many of them are not. It's interesting, where do we cry more? In public or in private? Where is it easier to cry? Private? Everyone thinks so? Public? So why in private? Is it easier?
You don't have to feel that you don't need to control yourself. You can let it all out.
You can let it all out. In public, you may feel self-conscious, restrained. In private, you can let it all out. Any other reasons why in private it would be easy to cry?
Sense of shame.
Shame. Could be embarrassing to cry. It's a sign of weakness. Whereas in private, it's like it's all right. So why would you say then the other way? Why would it be easier to cry in public?
More chance of getting support and assistance.
Mm-hmm.
Mentally.
Mm-hmm. That someone will see and react. Also, sometimes our emotions are only really activated by somebody else being there. In a funny way, sometimes we could experience something alone and not fully realize what's happened. But if somebody else is there and you gauge their reaction, so then you're allowed to react as well. It's interesting because the human being is a social being. We respond to those around us. So sometimes we might experience something and not realize or not compute. It doesn't quite register. Sometimes you've gone through something and it's only when you're telling somebody else the story that you suddenly realize the big deal that you just had. Sometimes if you go through something difficult, you hear bad news or you receive bad news, but it's only when you actually start telling somebody about it that it hits you, because you see their reaction and their response triggers you. Or you only allow yourself the emotion when somebody else is present. So it could go either way. You could say that tears will come when you're alone and no one sees, because you feel freer. It could be the tears will come more when you're with others, because the emotion is aroused, is triggered by their presence. But either way, to say that tears are just a function of trying to elicit the empathy of others, it's just not so convincing that that's what they're for.
Where do tears of joy come into this? Somebody has grandchild wins the lottery, tears of joy. You're not trying to elicit empathy, it's just
Correct.
It's a release.
Correct. So that would be another argument against tears being to elicit empathy, because then you don't necessarily need empathy. It's nice to share joy with others, but that's not a survival request, like it's not going to help me survive if I cry, and my tears of joy are not necessarily going to elicit joy in you either. So that explanation, the scientific explanation of tears as being to elicit support, doesn't really make sense for tears of joy, which are also uniquely human. So we need something deeper. We need a more profound view of what these tears are and why they are uniquely human. And fascinatingly, we find that the great mystical thinkers of Judaism, the Kabbalists and the Hasidic masters, explored this topic profoundly. And they preempted science and superseded it as well. There's one fascinating teaching from a Hasidic master. His name was Rabbi Pinchas of Koritz. Rabbi Pinchas of Koritz was one of the very early Hasidic masters. The Hasidic movement came out in the early 1700s. Its founder was Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, and he taught a new level of Judaism, the mystical, deeper level of Judaism, and he brought it into very practical to inspire the masses. And fascinatingly, around the same time as him, there was another individual, Rabbi Pinchas of Koritz was his name, a mystic as well, who was also coming up with a way of thinking. There was almost like a parallel philosophy to Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. Eventually they met, and Rabbi Pinchas became a student of Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. But in a way he became a a student colleague of the Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi Pinchas was younger than him, but he felt that he taught the Baal Shem Tov as well as received teaching from the Baal Shem Tov. And his teachings are recorded. He never wrote a book himself, but his teachings were short sayings that were recorded by his students and eventually compiled. And there are a couple of books. One's called Imre Pinchas, The Sayings of Pinchas. Medrash Pinchas is another one, The Teachings of Pinchas. And there's short little, very pithy, sharp insights into life that he would throw out. So in one of them, he said that if you see a child that cries a lot, you can expect that child to be very clever. I told my wife this, we were very relieved. That if you see a child that cries a lot, you can expect that one to be very, very clever. I don't know if we know from our parents how much we cried as kids. Thank God parents have an inborn amnesia, that they forget how much we cried when we were little. Although some of them, sometimes they do remember or will remind us, you didn't stop, you were crying all the time. You can try and find out if you can ask, find out how much you cried. If you cried a lot, those who cry a lot as a baby, they're going to be very clever. So says Rabbi Pinchas of Koritz. And he explains why in quite mysterious terms. He says, because what's happening when the child is crying is that they're actually cleansing their brain. The crying is a cleansing of the brain, a purification of the brain. And this is something, he says, that is unique to human beings. No other species cries, said Rabbi Pinchas of Koritz in the 1700s, because you have to have what he calls das behelim, which means you have to have hidden intellect to cry, because it's the hidden intellect that is being purified and refined. So are the words of Rabbi Pinchas of Koritz.
It's not colic.
That's right. Yeah, you don't need the sleep specialist to come in. The crying is good. Celebrate it. I've got a brilliant child here. So, in these brief lines, Rabbi Pinchas of Koritz is trying to give over. He defines what crying is, and he differentiates humans from animals, and that the ability to cry is the differentiation of that, and he explains why. So crying is the purification, the cleansing of the brain. So it's a good thing if you cry a lot, you're cleansing, you're refining, you're sharpening the brain. It's a development of the brain, okay. And the reason why animals don't cry, and only human beings cry, is because you need what he calls das behelim, a concealed level of consciousness, of mindfulness, of awareness. And if you don't have that, you don't cry. So animals, seeming what he's saying, is animals don't have this concealed intellect, so they don't cry, but humans do. What does concealed intellect mean? Das behelim, an awareness that is hidden. What does that mean? And how does crying help that? So it sounds like what he's saying with that phrase das behelim is he's describing the subconscious layers of intellect. There's revealed intellect and there's hidden intellect. There's our conscious mind, and then there's the unconscious, subconscious mind, that which is revealed in our mind, in our brain, with the information that we can readily access, and then the hidden information, the powers that our mind has that are not on the surface. Hidden. That's what he seems to be saying. And that wouldn't be unique to him. Many of the Hasidic masters spoke 200 years before Freud about the idea of the subconscious, of different layers of awareness, of the revealed mind and the hidden mind, or that which is on the surface and that which is beneath the surface in our awareness. And so this, he says, only humans have. Animals don't. Animals have intellect. They have a brain, they have intellect, they have awareness. But their awareness is an immediate one. They're aware of what's going on in front of them. And they have like a singular awareness, not layered. That's why they don't need to go to therapy. Although I think they do have these days, animal therapy. But that's probably for the owners. A human being has these layers of awareness, conscious and unconscious. And so Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz says that because a human has these layers, so therefore our brain needs cleansing, purifying, elevating, refining, and we do that by crying. So a baby that cries a lot is going to be very clever. They're going to refine, elevate, and sharpen that mind so the subconscious will be able to be expressed. And that is all he says. That is the end of Rabbi Pinchas Koretz's lesson on crying. I mean, it's fascinating to note that he there precedes science in so many areas that crying is uniquely human, and that it's an expression of the subconscious or a cleansing of the subconscious. But it's not all that explained. We find in the writings of the Chabad Rebbes, of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, who I mentioned earlier, the Alter Rebbe who wrote Tanya, and his son, Rabbi Dov Ber, known as the Mittel Rebbe, both of them expanded on the idea of crying, and they added another element that Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz didn't mention, that we find that Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, in one of his Mamarim, his discourses, where he would expound on deep mystical ideas, he says that crying is the experience that a person has when they are going through something that is beyond their capability of processing. When you experience an event, when you hear news, when you witness something happening that is too much for your capabilities, it's beyond what you can contain, the response is to cry. Meaning, in our daily life, as we're experiencing whatever's going on, when you're sitting at work and you're given a job to do or a task by a colleague or by your boss, or when you receive a phone call from a friend who makes an arrangement with you for the weekend, or when you check the news and you see what's going on in the world. So this is a receiving of information constantly. There are things happening around us that we're assimilating into our mind, into our heart, and we're responding intellectually, emotionally. We're given a question and we give a response. We're asked for our expertise in something at work, and so we respond to that. That's an intellectual exchange. An emotional exchange is where we interact with somebody, a friend, an acquaintance, and we either are happy with that interaction, we're not happy with what we just heard, we're annoyed by it, or we're excited by it. We're constantly interacting on mind and heart level, intellectually and emotionally. If we cry at any point, if anything that happens, or anything that we hear, causes us to cry, what has just happened? Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, we've just received something that we cannot contain, that does not fit, we cannot absorb it. So the response is to cry. Why? Because he says what happens at that point when we experience this overwhelming wave of whatever we just received, our brain becomes overloaded. It's something that we can't pull apart in our head. It doesn't sit in our mind. So the brain is overloaded. And what the brain then does is that it shrivels. It shrinks, it recoils from the information. Because our brain does not want to accept something that it can't handle. Our mind is not a vessel, it's not a container for this information. So it recoils from it. It's sort of like avoiding it almost. And that recoiling he describes as, in Hebrew, kivutz hamoach, which means a withdrawal or a squeezing almost of the brain. And this squeezing is a reflexive response of the brain to information that it cannot handle. And the squeezing causes some waste of the brain to be excreted in a liquid form that is expressed through our tear ducts as tears. So again, the experience is too much for us. The brain recoils from the experience, shrivels up, tightens. The tightening of the brain causes like a sweating, an excretion of liquid, which is waste material of the brain, which then overflows, comes out our tear ducts, our eyes as tears. And this is crying, says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe. Now, I don't think that Rabbi Shneur Zalman here is describing a biological process. He's describing a psychosomatic process, that you're experiencing something on an intellectual and emotional level, and it is being expressed on a physical level. It's not that the brain is shrinking, shriveling up in a literal sense and squeezing out some liquid that's popping out of your eyes. I don't believe that Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying that the teardrops are brain juice. But he's saying that what's going on internally when you receive some news that's beyond you actually has a physical manifestation, and it comes out as tears. So when we receive bad news unexpectedly, so we're not prepared for that, and that will shock us. Our mind cannot process that. And so the brain can't handle it. And because it can't handle it, the system is blocked. It can't go through. And that blockage, the brain, its reaction is to recoil intellectually and emotionally. And that inner squeezing causes a certain pressure. And the pressure is released by tears. what he's describing here seems to be quite a healthy process, that allowing the tears to come out will relieve that pressure of the brain. If we don't let it out, or if we don't let ourselves cry, so then the pressure remains inside, the brain remains recoiled, and the extra juices are not let out. Meaning, if we hold it all in, and we don't allow ourselves to cry, so then we've just experienced something we cannot process, and we don't process it. If we're able to process something, then maybe we don't need this expression, we don't need to cry. But that which we're unable to process needs to come through the system somehow. And the tears, the crying, is a certain release. We know sometimes we're unable to cry. We're sometimes in a state where we cannot cry. And we wish we could. Sometimes great trauma or very deep grief numbs us, freezes us, and stops us from being able to express emotion, and we can't even cry about it. And that is a very scary and unhealthy state, because something's being boiled up inside of us, where pent up emotion that is building up inside us, and it's not being expressed. And we know what's going to happen, that it will be expressed. It'll find a way out. It'll find some way to be expressed, but possibly in a not very healthy way. So somebody who has a lot of grief or sadness that they haven't been able to express, they haven't been able to feel as sadness and cry about, will be building up with frustration, and it'll probably be let out possibly as anger or frustration at other people. And usually we choose the people closest to us to be on the receiving end of that frustration. And so we're just angry and annoyed. Now, whenever we're angry and annoyed, there's always a justification for it. But the response is not commensurate to the justification. We overreact, and we're so easily annoyed and upset and angered. But that's because we're actually grieving or upset or needing to deal with something completely different, something else that we haven't allowed through our system. And so this is our other way of letting off steam, which doesn't really help and can be quite painful to those around us and destructive to our relationships. Allowing ourselves to cry is a release of that in a healthy way. It doesn't hurt anybody else. It's just allowing that which is too much to come out. So the Alter Rebbe here, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, is suggesting that the process of allowing tears to flow is allowing that pain to be released. And because it is what he describes as the waste of the brain being excreted, so it could be that after a good cry, we will be able to make peace somewhat with the pain that we need to go through. We haven't changed the situation. The pain and the grieving is still there, but the cry will maybe allow us to look at it, to experience it now, because we've made some room in the brain. This idea is explained a bit further by his son, Rabbi Dov Ber. The function of crying and the use of it was explained by Rabbi Dov Ber. He has a work called Teras Chaim, it's really his expansions on his father's teachings. The Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, would say discourses. Many of them are recorded in his other works. Tanya is one book he wrote, but there are other works of his teachings known as Torah or Likutei Torah. They're based on the parasha of the week, the weekly Torah portion, and they're the discourses that he said on a Shabbos. And most of them will go for 2 pages, 3 pages, sometimes 4 or 5 at the most. His son, Rabbi Dov Ber, in his time, would also give his discourses on Shabbos, and they'd usually be based on his father's talks. But on a talk that his father gave that was 2 or 3 pages long, Rabbi Dov Ber would have a 40 or 50 page discourse. Now, if you think your rabbi talks for a long time on Shabbos, Rabbi Dov Ber would be speaking for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours sometimes straight. And people would listen. And they say that when he spoke, he got into such a state of focused concentration that it was like the world didn't exist. In fact, sometimes when he was talking, he would say "shah, shah," which means be quiet. Shah, shh. And no one was talking. It was completely silent. And he later explained that what it was his own brain working. He had to quieten it when he was talking. It was making noise. The flow of ideas in his brain, he had to quiet his own brain. That was his level of connectedness. Anyway, so he would explain his father's ideas at length and expound upon them. So this concept, the concept of crying being a release from the brain, Rabbi Dov Ber explains as using some other words that might make it a bit clearer. He says that every single one of our limbs and organs of the body shapes itself based on the job it needs to do. The clearest example of that is our hand, that our hand with its fingers will move and shape based on what it needs to do. If you need to pick up a cup, so it grasps the cup according to the size of the cup. A bigger cup, the fingers move to be broader. And so to our feet when it's stepping, when you're going upstairs, so our feet move according to the size of the step. That's how we move. And our body, when we lie in bed, we snuggle up with the pillow and the blanket and position ourselves according to the need. We move ourselves around. And our eyes dilate according to the amount of light that is coming in and how much we have to take in. The eyes shape themselves in order to be able to see. So the brain does the same thing, he says. That the brain has an automatic reflexive response to the information and the experiences that we are taking in. So when the information that's being presented to us is simple, is relatable, is something that's on our level that we can handle, so the brain doesn't have to stretch itself. But when something arrives in our inbox, when we receive news that is difficult for the brain to handle, so it has to adjust itself. The squeezing of the brain that Rabbi Shneur Zalman was describing is the brain adjusting itself to receive this information. Because in my current state, I'm not ready for this. I can't handle this. So the brain stretches and squeezes within itself in order to make room for this new experience, this new concept, this new idea, this new piece of news that it needs to assimilate. And so it squeezes itself to get rid of some of the extra layers of consciousness that don't need to be dealt with. And so the excretion that Rabbi Shnei Zalman was describing is the brain saying, there's a lot of stuff that is just floating around in my mind that is extraneous, that is not so necessary. I need to get rid of that because I have something big that has just happened to me. Something life-changing has just occurred. And so the squeezing of the brain is the squeezing out of these sometimes petty or unnecessary pieces of information. And the overflow is expressed in the tears because it needs to come out somewhere. So it comes out physically in the tears. And what this does is it freshens the brain, it cleanses the brain to then be able to handle a new reality. To be able to face whatever challenge I've now been faced with. But I need to cry to do that. Because the crying is letting out some of that extra stuff. It's interesting that we can only cry if we're quite focused. We don't cry when we're distracted. One of the ways we protect ourselves from crying, if we don't want to cry, is distract ourselves. So if I don't want to cry about something, so I'll change the subject, or I'll occupy myself with something else. I'll get somebody to talk to me about a different topic. Tell me about your life, because my life is making me upset. And so when I'm distracted and thinking about something else, I can't cry at that moment. If my mind wanders from the distraction back to my own problems, so then I can tear up again. But I have to be focused on that. If I'm not focused on that, so then I'm not going to cry. Rabbi Dov Ber here is saying is that the brain wants to focus on this new information, on this troubling, difficult, challenging, upsetting information in order to be able to handle it. And so it squeezes itself, meaning it focuses on it and expels other things. So we can actually experience the pain and then adjust to that pain so we can move forward. If we're always pushing it off, if we're always avoiding the pain, so we won't cry because we're distracted. But the reality is still there. The pain is still there. It just hasn't gone through the system. It hasn't been expressed. It hasn't rested in the brain. And therefore it'll be expressed in other ways, with other frustrations. So the crying process is necessary for us to experience the pain and to make peace with it and to move forward. With this understanding of crying, if this is what crying is, why do some people cry more than others? What does it mean if a person is a very teary person, cries easily? What does it say about somebody if they don't cry? They never cry or rarely cry. What do you think?
I think someone who never cries is holding back their emotions and their feelings, and they tend to be all pent up because they can never release it.
Mm-hmm. So that could be one possibility. Is if somebody doesn't cry, hardly ever cries, never cries, is they're just stopping it. They're just not allowing it. So they're keeping themselves distracted, but they're not allowing this process to happen.
Or
Yeah.
maybe their brain has already come to a realization about certain realities in the world, and it's strengthened it towards confronting new information.
Mm-hmm. That's another possibility. Maybe if you only cry when you experience something that's beyond what your brain can assimilate, if your brain is very broad, so it can handle a lot, and so therefore, yeah, that the average experiences that a person goes through, while for one person that might be just too much to handle and they'll cry, for another person, they can handle that. They can grasp it. Like Rabbi Dov Ber said, just like your hand shapes itself for the object that you're picking up, and there are some things that are too big for you to pick up. In one hand, you need two hands, and there's some things that even with two hands, they're too big for you to pick up. But that depends on how broad your grasp is. Some people have bigger hands and bigger arms and can pick up something bigger, whereas others have smaller. So too with minds and with emotions and with hearts, some people can handle more, and therefore we would assume they'll cry less. That could be.
Maybe that person appears not to be crying because you can't see the tears, and they appear to be somebody who doesn't cry, but in their own way, internal tears are flooding.
Mm-hmm.
So it's our perception of
Yep.
when you see the tears, it means one thing, but
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't really.
Right. We don't really know what's going on inside.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The assumption you make if someone doesn't cry where others would is that they're a hard person, they're unempathetic, they're unemotional. It's almost like a negative connotation. If 6 people are crying at one event and the 7th person isn't crying, the assumption is that they're unemotional, unempathetic, or hard.
Mm. Well, according to this explanation, is that true? If somebody's not crying and everyone else is crying and you're not, does that mean you're hard and cold? Or does it mean that you have a broad ability to take it in? And it's not being expressed as crying. Could be that. And what about, yeah?
Another way of expressing this of the Lord, maybe there is another way, and some people do it through tears, and some other people do it in the other form.
Mm-hmm.
That's also possible.
Yeah.
So
So what about somebody who cries all the time? Who, any story they hear, they're in tears. Every time it doesn't have to be close to them. They hear a story about anybody, they open the news and they're in tears every time. What does that mean?
Small brain.
So it could be that they have a very small capacity to handle things, and therefore anything can trigger them, and they're crying. Doesn't mean they're unintelligent. This would suggest that their mind just cannot handle much. It goes easily to tears.
I'll put another slant on somebody like that, lets it all out rather than holding it back. And actually, because you tend to feel better after a good cry, and
Right.
that person is in a sense luckier to have that ability.
So they're freer. It could be that they're just freer in expressing their emotions. The person next to them would be crying just as much as them, but they're more controlled.
More in tune with it.
Whereas this person is more in tune and allowing their emotion.
But wouldn't it be like a small child cries a lot, and the older it becomes, the more control they gain over the situations and how to get what they want or how to change the environment they're in,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't need to rely on tears as much. So wouldn't it suggest that people who don't know how to do, they only have that they have not built that ability, the influence and control of the various situations, not only for themselves but for others. So
yeah.
that the only thing they can go to is what they know how to do is cry.
Right. Well, I guess if you're using crying as a means of communication or expressing where you're at, so then that's what a baby does, and that's the only means a baby has to express themselves at first, is just to cry. And one would hope that as you grow up, you learn other ways of expressing yourself. And that's something that we try to teach kids, that use your words. You know, don't just cry about it and use that as your expression to tell me what is going on, but use your words. Some children are better at that than others. We sometimes call a kid a crybaby, whereas that's not what they are. This is their way of expressing themselves, and they need to learn to express in other ways, because people are not going to react to that. On a practical level, if you just cry every time you need something, people don't know what you need. There's also no balance there of, is this a terrible tragedy or a minor need that you have? So you need to express. There's a big difference between that I'm in excruciating pain or I'm a bit thirsty and I need a drink. But if for both of them you cry, then that message is not going to get across. So you need to learn to use words. But it could be that child, it's not that they cry a lot, it's that they feel a lot. And so too with an adult. It's not that they cry easily, it's that they feel things more. They're more aware and alert to the world around them. They're more empathetic. The experience of pain, even of another's pain, is just more real to them. And so therefore, their readiness to cry is not that they cry more than... They'll cry the same amount as anybody else in quality, but not in quantity. They'll cry more because they're more attuned. So it's not that they've got a lower threshold of crying, that they cry easier. It's that they feel things deeper. So we can't really say, if a person cries a lot or cries a little, we can't say, well, that's good, that's bad. We have no idea. There's so many possibilities of why. It could be the person who cries very little is because they're insensitive and not in touch with themselves and not allowing themselves to express. Or it could be because they have a broad capacity to handle and to assimilate an experience without expressing it in tears. A person who cries a lot could be because they have just a low threshold and a little bit too open, or it could be because they're very deep feeling and deeply empathetic. So whether somebody cries a lot or cries a little, we can't judge ourselves or others what that means. But what these teachers seem to be trying to express is that crying is a good and necessary process. It's something we all need to do sometimes, because it lets out something that perhaps doesn't have another means of coming out in a healthy way. And so the experience of crying should not be one that we are avoid or are scared of or intimidated by. It should be something that we are open to let it happen. Because, as Rabbi Pinchas of Karitsa said, it actually cleanses our brain. The squeezing that Rabbi Shneur Zalman said, which Rabbi Dov Ber explained, means getting out the distractions, the meaningless things that have clogged up the brain, so we can really focus on an experience, really live it and have it. That is a good thing. So the tears are a way to do that. There was a mystical teaching, there was a tradition that if you ever find yourself crying sincere tears, tears of true empathy, not tears of just self-pity or wallowing in misery, but tears of real empathy, of caring about another person, or caring about even your own state, your spiritual state, that you feel you've disappointed yourself and you want to go higher. If you ever cry pure tears, so the mystic said, you should take those tears and wash your face with them. Physically wash your face with your tears. Because what that does, say the mystics, is it restores the divine image that you were created with. That Tselem Elokim, the divine image that every human being is created in the image of God. That image gets sullied by our involvement in immoral things, in wrong things. We become somewhat corrupted by the callousness of this world, the indifference of the world. When you cry sincere tears, those tears are so pure, you can wash your face with it, and it'll bring back the divine image. There were even some mystics who would keep their tears, gather them in a little jar. And there's a certain purity to those tears that are cried in purity. Of course, there are tears that are not productive. Rabbi Shneur Zalman in Tanya particularly says that tears of self-pity, of just feeling down about yourself, and where you actually start to enjoy the misery, that's not good. Like reveling in tears and in self-pity, that's not good, because that will not bring to any action. Sometimes when we cry, we feel satisfied by the tears. We feel good that we've done something because we cried about it. And that complacency is not good. Tears of disappointment, that I want to be better, I want to change, that's good. Tears of self-pity, that I'm just enjoying feeling bad about myself, that's not good. The tears have to be a part of a process of cleansing, of trying to reach higher.
You're talking about depression, kind of tears.
Yeah, in Tanya it says that depression is not an emotion, it's a lack of emotion. And those tears are not tears of expressing a feeling, it's just becoming numb. And that's not good. That needs to be worked through and worked on. But tears of true feeling, where I'm grieving for something, that's necessary. To mourn and to grieve is a necessary tears. But they have to lead to action as well. It has to lead to, so I need to move forward. I need those tears to wash me, to cleanse me, so I can move forward. Even tears about your own moral state. If you're disappointed with yourself, you feel bad about where you are and you should be better, you're feeling guilty about things you've done wrong. Even those tears, Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, they have to be very limited. You should set aside a time when you cry about it, schedule that time and give it a limit, and then finish. Now I've got to do something about it. Just to feel bad about yourself, but not do anything about it, that's a useless exercise. So just finally, there was another Hasidic master, Rabbi Shmilka of Nikolsburg. Rabbi Shmilka was also a student, like Rabbi Shneur Zalman, he was also a student of the Maggid of Mezrich. And he taught that we find in the Jewish calendar that the time we're in right now is interesting. The month that we're currently in is the month of Av. And it's during this month that both temples in Jerusalem were destroyed. And we have a fast day, the 9th of Av, which was just last week, commemorating the destruction of the temples. And this is a time of crying. The Tisha B'Av, this fast day is a time when we mourn the destruction of the temple and we cry over it, over the dispersal of the Jewish people and all the suffering and all the oppression that we've faced over a couple of thousand years since the temple was destroyed. We cry and mourn about it on Tisha B'Av. But he says that is like a child who in their early stages need to cry, because as Rabbi Pinchas Karitza taught us, for the mind to be developed, we need to cry. The baby has to cry to cleanse the brain, to allow the subconscious powers to come up. An animal can't do this because an animal doesn't have subconscious, we said. They don't have layers that they need to develop. An animal grows, but they don't grow exponentially. They don't develop new layers of awareness. Whereas a human being needs to. We need to experience life. We need to experience the various things that come over us, including the painful parts of life. We need to experience them fully. And we need to feel it, cry about it, and grow from it. We need to reveal deeper powers that we have to face adversity and difficulties. We need to dig into our subconscious mind and the powers that we didn't know we had to face whatever may come. That's why we need to cry. So the month of Av is like that early stage where we cry to feel again. Our heart is more aware now. After you've cried, your heart is open. You're more alert, you're more alive. Your mind is more capable of focusing and experiencing things. Things become more vivid for you because you're alive. Feeling an emotion means being alive. But after that, then you have to do something about your life. Then you've had your cry, you've had your cleansing, you've opened your mind, you've opened your subconscious, then you have to do something. And so Reb Shmelk of Nicholasburg said that's why after the month of Av is the month of Elul, which Elul is a time of introspection, but not a time of crying. Elul is the preparation for the high holidays, for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. After we've cried on Tisha B'Av, we've become more aware, alert, alive, our subconscious is lit. Now we have to start doing stuff to actually improve ourselves, to lift ourselves to a higher place. And so, if you didn't cry yet, so then you need to cry. You need to feel. You need to feel. You need to awaken your heart. You need to cleanse your face to bring back the divine image. But once you've done that, so then you have to start doing. The crying has to lead to doing, to becoming a deeper, greater, and better person. Okay. Any questions? Any comments? Yeah, want to have a good cry now?
Sorry? No, I'm really not correct. No, very easy.
Someone once described crying as perspiration of the soul, which is pretty much like what you described.
Yeah, that's right. Perspiration of the soul. So then what's crying for joy?
It's still a manifestation of the soul. The soul is happiness.
So the Alter Rebbe Rosh Zalman says it's a bit different to crying out of sadness. The sadness was the brain recoiling and squeezing out the liquid. Joy expands the brain. When you're joyous, your mind is broadened. And the broadening of the brain, you overflow. Sometimes when your mind just is blown so big, it overflows into tears. So the tears are your brain overflowing with expansiveness. Because it's got so big, it's broadened, so then the tears come out, which is a beautiful experience. It says many times in the Zohar, the students of the Kabbalah, they would hear a teaching from Rabbi Shimon, the teacher of Kabbalah, and their eyes would swell with tears because their mind was so expanded by the concept that it overflowed. So sometimes we tear up from just a feeling of joy and breadth and openness. That's also unique to human beings. We can cry with tears, we can also tear with joy. May we have many reasons to do that.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah.